Those that can do so rush forward, away from the fire. Applause as they approach the front of the stage. Cyrano and Frenchy, arms and legs fused together so they can never be parted, roll into the centre, back onto back onto back. A single bolt fastened through the jawbones of each keeps their heads locked in place, one pressed against the other, bent low. Emery slides out like a snake on his grossly stretched belly. Cax scuttles forward on limbs stripped to bone, the bones varnished and filed to points. Bidereau follows a little behind, moving awkwardly on cauterized stumps. His mouth gapes open, exposing a swollen black tongue pierced by a thick metal hook. There's a rusted chain attached, maybe 6 feet long. At the other end is a heavy tank of green liquid in which his severed hands and feet bob like dead white fish. He drags it with him wherever he goes. Bebel doesn't move yet. He can't. Not freely. For the moment he watches through his stained goggles, looking past the deformed monsters dancing before him, straining to make out the faces in the audience. The more agile take up positions at the front of the stage. Emery hangs his head over the edge, great flapping mouth opening wide as he roars as only a beast could. People in the audience laugh and cheer, instantly taken with the slithering behemoth. Behind him, Loopy, Ignat, and a few others are brought forward. Not Bebel. Not yet. These members of the troupe don't enjoy the luxury of free movement. They're wrapped in chains, attached to machines or otherwise restrained. Some, like Ignat, are little more than quivering torsos, limbs long lost. She hangs in a mechanical bracket, operating on a piston that drives her to and from the front of the stage. Nails have been driven into her bald scalp, from which dangle threads of razor-sharp metal. It has the appearance of long silver hair, and when she snaps her head from side to side, the threads strike the iron arms of her truss, creating sparks. The effect is quite striking and impossibly cruel. Loopy is operated via remote control. Somewhere off stage a switch is thrown and she rumbles into life. Her body begins to shake, shoulders quivering, head lurching. The exhaust pipes jutting out from between her ribs belch black smoke. Blood seeps out through her gritted teeth. There's a motorcycle engine in her belly. The block is visible where the metal has split the skin. Under her seat is a single motorcycle wheel, and it starts to roll now, inching her towards the front. When the revs get up, Loopy vomits blood. She can't make a sound, poor Loopy. Her throat is full of liquid. Can't speak, laugh, or moan, but her eyes are screaming.
This is the stage. These are the players. A young woman's sexual appetites prove too powerful to be undone by death. Hedonistic clubbers covet a drug that warps flesh rather than the mind. A wealthy cannibal encounters a meal too beautiful to be eaten. The lullaby man ushers another eager victim into his clockwork lair. Here is where such stories are told. Blood and beauty, defilement and deformity, music and monsters. Welcome to the Doom Cabaret. John McNee's Doom Cabaret was written by John McNee and published by the Sinister Horror Company in 2020. In this episode of Sinister Reread, Justin chats with John about one of the publisher's more twisted collections. Hello, this is Justin from the Sinister Horror Company, and I'm here chatting today with John McNee, the author of John McNee's Doom Cabaret, a collection of short stories. John, hi, how are you?
Hello, my friend. I'm very well, thanks. And yourself?
Yeah, I'm very good and very pleased to have you with me today to kind of talk about this excellent book. John McNee's Doom Cabaret, the short story collection. Why did you write it?
There's a couple of reasons. Every every horror author that I really respect, or that I really enjoyed, everyone that influenced me, sort of they all had a short story collection, sort of a definitive short story collection, something that was there as an introduction to them. You think of, Clive Barker with the Books of Blood, or Ray Bradbury with the October Country, Kathy Koja, Extremities, these kind of things. So I always wanted, as someone who sort of aspires towards a career in the horror writing field, wanted to have a collection of short stories that would be my kind of shop windows, sort of say, here's what John McNee's about, so that people could pick it up and understand the kind of the stories, the kind of themes that they're going to get from a John McNee work. And so it was always in my mind to have, when I started trying to get stories published, it was always in my mind that they would be collected into a short story collection at some point. Because all of the collections that I always read, they always had a bibliography at the back that said where they'd been published and when. And I thought, well, that means obviously I have to, if I want to have a short story collection, I need to have all of these short stories pre-published in different anthologies and magazines. That's the way it works. I thought, I didn't think you could just go straight to publishing it without all that. And the other reason is, I mean, I had three books published before John McNee's Doom Cabaret, but they were all with American publishers. So as much as you can do stuff online, and I certainly try to market them and everything else, I wasn't able to go to any conventions or anything like that. So I wanted to put something out with a British publisher so that I could go to the conventions and stand with them and be a part of that whole marketing experience when they were sort of selling my book to people. And that, it's just a bit of a shame that the way the timing worked, that as soon as I managed to get that off the ground, COVID happened and there have been no conventions up to now. But that was a big part of it for me, as well as sort of staking my claim as a horror writer, to sort of say, here I am, announce yourself to the world. I mean, I've been writing I've been published in various places for about 10 years now. So you'd think I would have got a bit further but this is really my announcement after 10 years of saying, hey, there's this new author on the scene. His name is John McNee. That's still the way I see it.
Yeah, and you talk about the release just kind of came out as COVID kind of kicked in and lockdown kind of happened, it really. But hopefully conventions will reopen back up and you can get on the circuit to show everybody your wonderful reading skills, because you've done some stuff online, but it's like you say, it's not the same, is it really? It's that kind of live experience. So that's the reason why you wrote the collection, and you talked about sort of some of your influences in there. I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit more. So if you could talk about, like, who would you say were your influences, your biggest influences when it came to the writing of the stories in this book, whether that be other writers or any other kind of works of art, or anything else that's inspired you?
Oddly, one of the biggest inspirations, apart from the writers, was I don't know if you know the TV series The Hunger.
I don't think so, no.
It was a Ridley Scott produced TV series which had the same name as his film, with Bowie and Catherine Deneuve and Susan Sarandon, but it had absolutely nothing to do with that. It was a horror anthology series, a sexy, erotic horror anthology series, which I think was in the late 90s or thereabouts, and it was not great. But I watched it when it came out on DVD, and I could see the potential in it, in these kind of sexy horror stories, and they were all fairly short, and a lot of them were based on published short horror stories. And when I was watching it, this is when I must have watched it, I think back in 2006 or thereabout, and I was frustrated by it. And this is when there was no horror on television, so you really had to look up stuff that had gone before. And I got to thinking, I would love to make a series like that, but I don't know how to write screenplays. So maybe if I wrote a collection of short horror stories, someone would adapt it into a television show. I mean, I was at university then, so I had a lot of time on my hands to go on these wild fantasies about how the world works. But at the time, I didn't really know if you could write horror stories like those, the kind of things that I was envisioning, the kind of bloody, sexual, sort of hardcore, extreme. I mean, it's hard to imagine now, but at the time, that stuff was very difficult to come across. I mean, Amazon, I didn't even have an Amazon account back in 2006. I don't think I had a credit card or anything like that. So no one did online shopping, or at least I didn't. So I would go around used bookshops, secondhand bookshops, to look for horror books, to find out whether that kind of writing that I wanted existed, and had a really hard time because it was horror. The best horror they had was airport horror, effectively. The books that people take on holiday with you, the mass market, and all this kind of stuff. But I found a book by, and I meant to look up the pronunciation of her name before I came on this podcast, but Kathy Koja. I found her novel Skin in a shop, and it completely opened my eyes to what horror fiction could be, the kind of extremes it could go to, the kind of boundaries you could push, the kind of language you could use. It didn't have to be the straightforward, not to disparage anyone, but the sort of the best-selling names in horror, the suspense variety. It could be something much darker. And that, discovering her and Clive Barker led me to discover splatterpunk fiction and go down those kind of roads. I managed to find the first, I think it's called Splatterpunks, the anthology that effectively coined the term, and that's got things like Clive Barker's Midnight Meat Train, which again it really reaches out of the page and grabs you in a visceral way. And I was like, yes, this is the kind of stuff that I want to do. And so those are the kind of writers that I've aspired towards. And they're all, again, it's mostly, I've read a lot of short stories, a lot of short fiction, and tried to, and I can't really emulate them. No one can emulate Kathy Koja, but they have their own voice. Someone like Joe Lansdale as well. You can read that on the page. They're not beholden to any one particular style or the style of writing that we were all taught at school. They managed to find their own voice, and that's what I aspired to do. That's how they influenced me, was to sort of push myself beyond the comfortable realms of the kind of stories I'd been writing up until that point, which were effectively, PG-15. I realized, I saw that you could take it further. It sounds a bit naive to say it now, because there's so much extreme horror out there. When you read someone like Matt Shaw and people like that, it's like, well, all right, there's much more extreme places I could take it to. But at the time, this was eye-opening to me, and so those are the kind of stories I was writing for. I mean, those were the first stories I had published, and subsequently the stories that, the best of which kind of make up this collection.
So you talked about a couple of different writers,
Yeah.
which are kind of sort of inspired you from there. And one of them that you mentioned early on, but you didn't speak about in that point was Ray Bradbury in his October Country.
Hmm.
That was the book there. So when did you come across that one, and how did you find that inspired you? I only asked that because it's a book which I really love, but only discovered recently, and I don't hear very many horror authors actually talking about it.
Well, that's going way back for me, because that wasn't one I discovered back when I was touring bookshops. That was one my father used to take my brother and I camping. And he had an old edition of the October Country, and he would read uh, short stories to us when we were in the tent on Arran or somewhere, um, to put us to sleep, which didn't really work because you were telling these haunting psychological stories about a man at war with his own skeleton and things like that, and the carnival with its twisting mirror, which shows you exactly how evil or righteous you are on the inside, and things like that, and the jar, which is an amazing story, and so that's that goes all the way back. That's that's where I think a lot of my love of horror itself comes from, that collection and hearing those stories. And I read an awful lot of Ray Bradbury after that, and a lot of his sci-fi stuff. But I think he's a very, very underrated horror writer because it all still holds up. I mean, a lot of it's chilling. And one of my favorite short stories of all time, which is not in the October Country, is The October Game by Ray Bradbury, which is absolutely merciless. It's just, I mean, he was quite a cuddly figure, I think, in the public consciousness for the Martian Chronicles and Ray Bradbury Presents and everything else, and all his marionette stories. He seemed like quite Dandelion Wine, and he seemed like quite a sentimental old chap. But you read those old horror stories of his, I mean, they are disturbing on a number of levels. And there's that mean streak, that merciless kind of darkness. They weren't particularly bloody, any of them, but that's the kind of punch that I look for in a horror story. He ended stories better than just about anyone else. There was horrible twists to the tales, and so that's influenced me, certainly. I don't think I've come close to writing anything on Ray Bradbury's level, but I definitely aspire towards it for sure.
So it's kind of all your dad's fault, really, all of this.
Yeah, yeah. I think I don't even know why he had the book. He doesn't. He didn't have any other horror books in his collection. It was all sort of sci-fi and astrophysics and stuff, and a lot of classics. But so I suppose that was influential as well, because it was, for a long time, they were the only horror stories I'd read, and that was my understanding of what they could achieve and the kind of chill they could put through you.
So that's talking about your influences. Now, where did your inspirations come from? Like, where do you get the ideas for your stories?
Well, that's a bit of a tough question to answer. I can, if we went story by story, I think I could pick out. I got this from there and this from here. You never know.
I mean, if you want to, or if you want to take a selection of them, I'd love to go to do that and find out. Absolutely. And by all means, when you're talking about the stories, when we have these conversations, don't worry about trying to hide any spoilers. This can be reading because we want to go in depth. So, talk as freely as you like about the stories.
Well, a lot of it comes from music and art and looking around the place for influences. I liked, I don't do this much lately, but I used to like going online and searching for dark art and seeing what kind of ideas it inspired in me. There's quite a number of paintings I clipped and saved, and I think there's something in that would make a fantastic story. Babel was one. There was a painting. I mean, I don't have it now, but there was a painting someone did of this sort of grey man who was naked except for a gas mask, that looked like the top of which was organic and reaching out a mouth and tentacles and all sorts of things like that. And I thought, I saw it and I said, I want to write a short story about this guy. I want to know what's going on in his head. You know, it's like a lot of book covers, I think, for horror stories, particularly at the more extreme end. They find these fantastic images, these disturbing, horrifying images. And then you read the book, particularly if it's an anthology or something, it'll have nothing to do with the image on the page. They've just sort of found the most horrifying, disturbing artwork they can to help sell the book, which is fine. And they can say it's representative of a theme of the book. But they're not actually telling the story of this particular monstrosity on the page. And that's what I want to do. I want to hear their story. I want to know, read the kind of stories that you can't really imagine telling because they're so fantastical, because this thing could never happen. If you think about the Deadite press covers, the Rath James White covers and things like that, I can't remember the name of the artist who does them, but you see images like some impossible malformation of flesh and metal that's bleeding and could not possibly be alive but is still weeping, and you want to know, well, what's happening to them? How did they get there? I want to tell those stories. So this is the kind of stuff that rattles around inside my head, and that's the kind of thing that inspires something like Babel, which is full of these impossible creatures. And so art has been good for that. And then you consider something like Skunk Jr., for example. I mean, that was I just had an idea. I think I was still at school, and I had a prompt for a short story idea. I imagined the snow continuing to fall after a car crash. Someone being trapped in a tangle of metal, and having passed out, awakening to snow falling softly, and then looking in a sort of beautiful way, and then looking around to see the devastation that's around them. And that was an idea that stayed with me from school forever, and I could never think of what would happen next. I had the idea that he was a guy who would see, various other people after this car accident lying in the snow, and there was some horrible spectre coming around picking them off, or there was a man going amongst the wreckage, or he saw something and had to come back. And then it eventually became, it was his partner who was pregnant and she was dead, and then it was someone appearing who would carve the baby out of her stomach, and a bunch of people would, the sheriff and various other folk would have to send out a search party into the woods. But I never got any further than that, and I spoke to a friend of mine. I told him this story. I said, well, there's this search party in the woods. They've followed some guy who's stolen a baby from a dead woman's stomach at this cart wreck, but I have no idea what happens once they get into the woods. And this friend of mine, Bob Girvin, who's helped me with a number of ideas, he said, they find a baby skull nailed to a tree. And I thought, all right, okay, let's go with that then. And the rest of the story just sort of spills from there. So I've always been open. You ask me where I get my influences from. I should point out, I am always open to other people's ideas. I mean, if they're happy to share them and happy for me to use them, I'm not afraid to poach ideas from other people. Because sometimes I can't get very far on my own.
Well, that's interesting. I don't hear it from a lot of people, but I have heard it. I mean, I did hear it in a Chuck Palahniuk interview where
really
he would talk around that he would find that he'd go to the gym and he'd talk to people at the gym about where he was with a book when he was stuck, and ask them their opinions. And so it's that kind of sort of thing with yourself, is it? When you just talk about the story, so you're willing to let people know about your creation as you're creating it, as it were, and then get feedback from them? Yeah.
I've done it a fair amount. I would not do it down at the gym, but I think you have to trust the person involved, or I do. Certainly, there's not many people I would talk knock around ideas with. But if they're prepared to help, and I think their ideas are good, then why wouldn't I keep going back to them? Because sometimes your own head, it's not enough to see the possibilities. You need someone else to see it from a different angle, I think, to tell a good story. And there's something like Repulsive Glamour. I can tell you what the influence was for that. I mean, that's a story about a drug that warps flesh rather than the mind. I saw an article years back about the drug crocodile. You've heard of this?
No, what's that?
It's a horrendous drug. It was ravaging parts of Eastern Europe and I think Russia for a while. I don't know what exactly the high is you get off of it, but it's something that you can kind of make from a number of household chemicals, and it gets you high to a certain point, like meth or something else along those lines. But one of the side effects is that it decays your flesh. So, and I don't know how it does this, but something to do with the chemicals that you're huffing, obviously. But it works its way inside your body, and then it sort of rots you from the inside out. So I saw all these pictures of crocodile users who, and they call it crocodile because it turns the skin, the epidermis, to scales, and then when that sort of melts away, you're left with bone. And so I saw these pictures of crocodile users in the late stages of decomposition while still alive, with their bones protruding from their flesh. And that inspired me towards, well, what if the point of a drug was that it warps your flesh? What if that's what folk wanted? And I've seen so many, I mean, I am interested in body modification. Not that I would ever, from a purely academic standpoint, because it's never something I would do on my own, and I'm not interested that much in piercings or tattoos, but extreme body modification. I'm curious about that, the people who would push themselves so far and are willing to do all these things to themselves, to put their bodies to such extremes, surgically or otherwise. The psychology of that interests me, and I thought it would be interesting to write a story about the kind of person who psychologically was willing to entrust the modification of their precious body parts to a recreational drug, which did horrendous things to them, but strangely, potentially beautiful things as well.
One of the ones I want to have a chat about as well, for inspiration where that came from, was the Lullaby Man.
Yeah, that's kind of a tough one. I think that was the first, the original draft of the Lullaby Man was the first horror story I ever wrote.
Oh, right. And when was that? Like, how old were you, sort of thing? What was the context of the time frame?
When I say the first horror story, I mean I'd written a lot of short stories growing up, and various different genres, and I did my fair share of Goosebumps rip-offs and things like that as a kid. But then when I was, again, we're going back to like 2006. I just graduated university. I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. I had a lot of time on my hands, and I just watched it wasn't urban gothic. It was I just watched The Hunger, and I really, really wanted to watch a horror anthology show that was full of sexuality and violence, and there just wasn't anything that existed at the time. It was a long time before any of these horror shows that have cropped up since would come along. Pre even Masters of Horror, I think there was nothing. And so I thought, well, if no one's going to produce this stuff, I'm going to have to write these stories myself. And after I'd read various different books from charity shops to teach myself how different horror could be and how extreme you could get, I challenged myself to try and write something that would break the boundaries of what I'd previously been willing to write. I don't know whether it continues to affect other people as they grow older, but at that time, I sort of had this fear of writing anything too extreme in case my parents read it, in case they were horrified.
I know exactly what you mean. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I had to read all these books to see what horror fiction was actually like, and then I had to write something which I didn't intend to publish, obviously not, because it was my first horror story. But I was effectively writing it to give myself license to write things that would horrify my parents. That just to allow myself to break through that kind of hesitance and that kind of protective wrap I'd put around my own self, so that I'll never write anything that really pushes any boundaries, that really makes anyone too uncomfortable. So this was an attempt to do that. I thought I would write a story. What's the worst thing that you can possibly write about? Child abuse, right? So I sort of came up with this idea of a young woman who had been, as a child, abused by her imaginary friend. And that's the basic template, that's the basic idea, right? And when you say it like that, it sounds crass and horrible. And the challenge is, how do you write a story with that concept and make it not necessarily palatable, but sort of accessible, sort of disturbing in a kind of roundabout way, so that it's not, sort of in your face unpleasantness. You know what I mean? That was where the idea came from the Lullaby Man. It was trying to write something that was too horrible to write about, and then writing it. And the first draft, you couldn't, I wouldn't show it to anyone now. But I wrote it and rewrote it again and again down the years to get it to a point where I thought it was worthy of being published. And there were a number of different concepts that went into that sort of changed it over time. But the central idea of the Lullaby Man being an imaginary figure who can appear who's full of songs and stories, and then at one point it all turns, became originally, I think the story was a girl talking to her, or a woman talking to her psychologist or counselor, trying to convince him that this thing that had been tormenting her was real, and that he had this, that he took her out of her bed and could freeze time so that no one ever knew that this was happening, and she was sort of suffering in silence unimaginably, and no one would believe her because it was impossible. I mean, the idea of it's sort of the idea of a supernaturally gifted child molester is not it's not a particularly nice one. But I sort of massaged that over time and went a few different directions to sort of craft a bit more of a story to it, so that it became a kind of hunt in the end. It wasn't about someone being abused, it was about someone seeking retribution for that. And how on earth do you do that when the individual you're seeking retribution against is an impossible monster who everyone thinks is a figment of your imagination? So that took a lot of work to figure that out.
So with regards to your actual writing process, then that story took a long time. You wrote it, you kind of rewrote it, so you had all these different drafts going on. I mean, was that usual with the stories that are in Doom Cabaret? I mean, how do you actually physically sit down and write stories? Do you sit down and go, right, I'm going to come up with an idea and then search for inspiration or is it these inspiration which has been built up slowly over time?
It's a story that forms very, very gradually over time, usually. Occasionally, they come absolutely fully formed. They just sort of appear one night. Dead Diana was like that. It was just there. I have no idea where that story came from. I haven't got the faintest idea. It just sort of popped into my head, fully formed. It's like, this is what happens. This guy kills this girl, and then she comes back from the grave and wants to finish what they started. And this is what she does on the first night. This is what she does on the second night. This is what she does on the third night. This is how it ends. And it was just there immediately. And so I wrote that. The version that appears in the book is very, very close to my first draft. Babel, similarly, is close to my... Although Babel, there was originally Babel, as it appears in the book, was just the prologue. You know, there was supposed to be a whole adventure that Babel went on after his introduction, but I wrote the introduction of the character, and it ended up being 5,000 words. And I was like, well, okay, I may as well just finish it there. I think that's a good little place to end it. But for me, it's mostly, I mean, I do take a long time on just about everything. I take a long time thinking about most of the ideas. Dead Diana and Babel, they're outliers. Usually it's stuff that I've been thinking about for months, if not years, and I don't usually start writing the story until I at least know how it begins and ends. And the other stuff in the middle, I'll figure out. And then when it's a short story, it usually takes me, there are exceptions, but it usually takes a month at least to get the first draft out. And it's all fits and starts. It's a paragraph here, a couple of lines there, take them out, go back, rewrite that bit. And eventually often the final draft or the first draft is very close to what actually appears when it's published, or what I'll send to a publisher, because I sort of edit as I go along. Although the last couple of years, that has sort of changed to the point where I've been writing a lot more drafts than I used to. Sort of sending a story to someone and they say, I can see what you're going for, but it doesn't work. This is what you need to do. And then having to go back and rewrite it from top to bottom. And I don't know why that happens more now than it used to. I think it's some kind of, either I'm getting more ambitious in the writing that I'm doing, which I would like to think that's the cause. Either that, or I'm devolving to the point where I can't get it right on the first draft the way I used to. But no, I am doing a lot more drafts these days.
Now, you sort of say, you think about these stories, they're in your head for like, months, sometimes years before you sit down to write them. And you said you usually have a start and an end before you sit down, and you kind of work out the middle. So when you work in the middle, is that you are writing and feeling it as it goes, or do you create a rough plan first before you sit down and actually do that writing?
A bit of both. Sometimes I like to have story points and then grey areas in between. It's great if you can have, well, I know this has to happen at this point and this has to happen at that point. But as long as I have the start and the ending, that's good enough to begin for me, and the rest I will figure out. The Midnight at the Doom Cabaret was one of those. I mean, the first, that was a story that I had in my head for years and years and years. I knew how it started with the first line, and I knew exactly how it ended. And I had a broad idea of what would happen along the way. I knew who these characters were and how they would interact and what they would do, roughly, the main plot points. And the first draft was, 20,000 words? And it incorporated, because I'd been thinking about the story for so many years, there are all these different disparate elements that I put in at different stages along the way. I'd like be sitting thinking about it in one summer, one summer's evening and go, oh, that's good. I'll put that in. That takes care of that. And then 3 years later, I'd think about something that happens 2 scenes later and go, oh, right, now that's good. I'll put that in there. And then when I finally came to actually write it, the different bits that I'd come up with didn't fit each other. They didn't work alongside. I was sort of messing together too many things. There were characters that I put in that I couldn't remember exactly why I put them in there. It was great when I came up with it, about 5 years ago. I thought, that's a really clever idea. But then when I actually wrote it out, it just didn't have the magic to it. So the final draft is half the length of the first one, and it's the opening is the same, the ending is the same, everything in between is completely rewritten, and yet the characters are still the same, their relationships are still the same, the stuff that they do to each other is still effectively the same, but every word and the nuances of it and the dialogue and all that sort of stuff, that I all changed, and it came together, I think, on the second attempt. Maybe that's why my drafts need more work now, is because I've had these ideas now for so long that they're becoming warped to the point. If you have an idea, if you get an idea when it's fresh and put it on paper, maybe that's what I was doing back in the day. But now I'm sort of getting to ideas that I've been gestating so long that they need a bit more work to get out. Certainly that was the case with Midnight at the Doom Cabaret.
And with Midnight at the Doom Cabaret, you've had it for that long, so these little bits start getting added on. So you found that you were putting too much into it, so you had to kind of streamline some of this out to get the main core of the story back out?
Yeah, definitely. There's all these sort of little meandering diversions and character ideas. There's so much more that didn't even go in the first draft. There was this whole subplot I had about a doll's house that existed in a crawl space underneath the cabaret itself, and they would go down and visit it, and it would have representations of each of them in the doll's house, and it was sort of magically changed depending on who was there and who was not, and it would sort of predict things about who was going. And it seemed like a great idea back when I came up with it, but I couldn't remember what on earth the point of it was. There's various different things like that, and there's a whole excursion to the main character, Natalie's squat, where she was living in an abandoned office block, which again was great for some reason, but completely unnecessary when you actually looked at it's all about the Doom Cabaret itself. You want to stay there. Just keep all the characters locked in that mad little space under the ground with its low ceilings, and keep them tight in that space. So there's all these sort of things you don't know what works and what doesn't until you actually put it on the page, and usually get it until you get it read by someone else. I'm not a very good judge of my own work when I've certainly not immediately after I've written it. Sometimes, very rarely, because for me the story that's in my head is never the same as what appears on the page. There's all these gaps that you have to fill in. There's all these things that you haven't accounted for. All these ideas that you can't quite, no matter how hard you try, you can't quite get it the way on the page that you see it in your mind. And so it's always a compromise, by the end of which, I imagine it's true for any author, when you're reading the story, there's the story on the page and there's the story in your head, and it's difficult to separate the two. You may be reading all this stuff on the page, but you're still thinking, you've still got all this baggage, all the background to the characters, all the stuff in your head, so you can't see it objectively. So you need to send it to somebody else to say, does this bit work? I have no idea. I honestly haven't a clue. Please tell me. So that's a massively important part of the process.
We'll come on to that a little bit later. I just want to go back onto one thing where you talked about when you're writing your first draft. So your first draft largely becomes kind of as near as close to the sort of final draft, because you're taking that time and you're spending doing it. So when you're but one of the points that you picked up why it takes so long is you kind of edit as you go.
Mm-hmm.
So can you kind of sort of explain that process? Does that mean that, like, say you've written something, so the next time you come back you reread that one bit, or do you go back right to the start and reread elements and then moving stuff around and editing stuff out? What does self-editing in that process look like for you?
Well, a lot of it happens naturally because I forget where I am. I don't write every day. I know you're supposed to, and I wish I could. But like I say, I write in fits and starts. So when I come back to writing a story, I never remember where I left it. So I have to go back and read through the whole thing again to remember the rhythm I was writing in, exactly where I was, what I had planned to do next. And when you're rereading something, that's when you spot mistakes, or you think of something that would be good to put in there, and all that kind of stuff. And so you edit it as you go. I love writing dialogue. That's the easiest thing for me. And the thing I hate most is writing the little bits in between the dialogue, aside from he said, she said, the little actions that give a sort of clue as to the way that someone's saying something. You can't just say he smiled, she shrugged. You can't just keep doing that over and over again. You've got to come up with other ways of implying action and nuance. And I don't know how other writers seem to do it so easily, because I never notice when I'm reading something how they're doing it. But those are the bits that really annoy me. So there's a lot of times, if I'm in the zone, to use a well-worn phrase, that I'll just write the dialogue and forget about the rest of it. So I'll come back and fill that in later when I'm feeling better, when I'm feeling more up to it. When I'm ready to spend an afternoon just going back into a conversation and just making clear where someone was, what they were doing, what might have been going on in their head, how they might have been playing with a cuff on their jacket or something like this, to try and put a little bit of a beat between one thing someone says and something someone else says, and that's a lot of it. So yeah, oftentimes it will be, that's how I'll do it, just sort of editing as I go, and then getting to the end and finding, and you only need to do, if you do that, oftentimes you only need to do a couple more passes on it before it's good to go.
And you talked about all the ideas that you kind of, you basically shed effectively. You've got all these ideas for stories that have been there for a long time, and you've got to kind of streamline that when you get into the actual writing of them. So what do you do with these other ideas? Do you write them down in a notebook, or do they just sit in your head and swim around in your consciousness?
I think the reason I write is because these ideas swim around in my consciousness. I think I don't massively enjoy the process of writing. I enjoy having written, because I have these ideas, and then if I don't write them down, they don't go away. They just stay there, trapped in my head, keeping me awake at night, bothering me. And the only way to excise them is to put them on the page, and then they leave me alone. So yeah, anything I don't have, or anything I haven't used, can often crop up again. Maybe sometimes the act of writing it down, even if it's excised from the final draft, will get rid of it from my head, and that's fine. That's good. That's a good result for me, because it frees up the space in my brain. But anything I haven't used, and any idea that I've been trying to turn into a story and haven't figured out how, it just stays there and torments me. So I know I'm going to have to figure out how to do something with it at some point, and that's really why I think that's the main reason I do it, because otherwise I'm just stuck with these, and there's only so much space in my head.
You might sound like you think you're coming across a bit mental saying it, but I completely empathise with that. I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah,
It's like exercising a demon, isn't it? Writing it and getting it away from your brain.
yeah, it's partly that, and it's also this notion of what if, imagine I think that's a good idea, right? I've got this great idea for something. I could just not write it. That's what I could do. That's what plenty of other people do with their great ideas. They just don't act on them. But I've got this idea. And then I'll be tormented by the thought of what if? Well, what if I had written it? What if it had turned out to be something really, really special? And it's not just the idea then that's bothering you. It's the idea of if you don't use it, what could have been? What could I have gotten out of this if I just sat down and applied myself to the problem of telling this story? So that's a second layer of anxiety to the problem.
Just to add a bit more.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I really.
Well, the third,
it's torture.
what if somebody else did your idea? What if somebody else did it and then it became amazing and they got lots of money or something from it?
People have done it. Loads of people have done it. And I had a great. I've had a number of great ideas. I'm not going to say necessarily what they are because I'm hoping people forget that other people have done them, and then I can do them again. But yeah, that's happened a number of times. The most bizarre one. I had this story I wrote, and again, it wasn't great. It was one of the first 4 or 5 I wrote after back when I was still effectively a student. After I'd written The Lullaby Man, I wrote I think it was just after that I wrote another story called Meat for the City, right? And this was, I'd been watching the Donald Pleasance film, which is called something. It's a horror film, Deathline. You know Deathline?
Yes, yeah, I know Deathline.
Right. I'd been watching that one night on mute, and I don't remember exactly when I started watching it. It was like in the last half hour, and I just had it on, and I was and it's this guy and his girlfriend are being terrorized by a homeless man who's lived underground in the London tubes all his life, and he's chasing them up and down the tunnels. And I thought, well, this is, and eventually they defeat him or something like that. And I thought, well, that's good, but wouldn't it be better if it turned out that he was only out to kill them because there's also this secret underworld of demonic creatures that lives, or ancient gods that live under the earth as well, that down there with him, and they've forced him into this. And then at the end, the hero has to take his place. And I thought, and wouldn't it be a great idea if this was set in the Edinburgh's underground city? The underground city story of Edinburgh, like Mary King's Close and all that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so imagine they discover another Mary King's Close, like someone doing some construction work, discovers another subterranean city under Edinburgh, and then a guy goes down with his girlfriend to investigate it. They discover a crazed lunatic down there who tries to kill the girlfriend. They get one over on the guy, but then these demons come out, they kidnap the girlfriend, and they say to the hero, now that you've defeated our killer who brings us sacrifices each night, you must go topside and take his place, or we'll kill your girlfriend or whatever. So I wrote that story and put a lot of effort into it as well. And then I read The Midnight Meat Train by Clive Barker, which is the same story. I mean, it's not got the Edinburgh underground city, but beat for beat, it's basically the same thing. It's got the same characters and the same motivations and everything like this. And I thought, well, how have I done that? Because I'd never read it before. This is way back before the film as well. So I don't know how to take that. Do you take it like, well, I'm obviously very clever because I'm having the same ideas for stories that Clive Barker's had, but it also renders the writing of the story utterly pointless because no one would ever take it because they just think I was ripping him off.
So you mentioned earlier about when you're writing, you're so close to it, and you've got all this baggage in your mind that you can't see the writing necessarily for just what it is by it standalone. So like, does this work? I just don't know. I need someone else to look at it. So I kind of want to talk about that with your short stories. Do you? So I take it you use other people, use what people refer to as beta readers. You know, people to look at it and then give you feedback.
Really, there's pretty much only one guy I used for all these stories. Again, it's my mate Bob Girvin, who supplied the idea for the baby skull in Skunk Jr. and a few other ideas. And he's not a writer himself, but he's sort of an ideas man and a good critic, and not afraid to say where, tell you what works and what doesn't. And you need someone like that. There's any number of people that I could show my stories to, and they would tell me, whatever I've done, oh, it's fantastic. You're so talented. What a wonder you are, John. It's like, if only I could write like that. But it might not necessarily be true. So it's the tough thing is finding somebody whose opinion you value and you can actually rely on. And he hasn't been reading my stories lately because he's like, busy. People grow up. He was really useful back when back when we were both just graduated and neither of us had a job or partners or children or mortgages to pay for. So now he's got all that sort of stuff. So he doesn't really have time for me anymore. So it gets a bit tougher. And I probably will have to start recruiting beta readers in the future for anything that I'm really unsure about. Occasionally, there's a few times when I felt confident enough to send something to a publisher without needing to have it checked over by somebody else. But those are getting rarer, those instances. So yeah, I could do with somebody that I could really trust to give me not just feedback about what works for them and what doesn't work, but how I could fix it. Especially if you can find it in someone who's not a writer themselves. It's a really valuable commodity to have and really tough to find in people.
So John, one of your other talents lies not just in writing, but in music. I've seen you play the piano on a number of occasions online, as well as cooking, but that's something else we'll chat over. But music is obviously something that you enjoy and something that you're kind of passionate about. And the reason why I kind of bring this up is I'm always fascinated to understand the environment upon which upon how you write. And when you were writing the stories within this collection, were you listening to music, or do you prefer silence or the TV on? And if you were listening to music, what kind of music, and did it have any influence upon the writing, do you think? What is that environment that you're in when you're writing those stories?
I could put together a mixtape for you. I mean, I have a huge library of music I have specifically for playing in the background when I'm writing horror stories. With the Doom Cabaret stories, it's a book that kind of almost needs a soundtrack because it is about performance, and music is a big part of music and artistry and performance. It's all part of many of these stories. Some of the characters are musicians, and some of them are certainly in the company of live bands and things like that frequently throughout. So yeah, I was listening to a lot of music during the writing of it. There's a whole genre of music called dark cabaret, which is pretty much bang on for what Doom Cabaret is all about. It encapsulates a lot of the same kind of themes, the darkness and musicality and performative nature of horror, grand guignol, and all this sort of stuff. And it's bands, I mean, a lot of obscure stuff, but the most sort of well-known dark cabaret artists, I would incorporate things like, Amanda Palmer and the Dresden Dolls, things like that, which I'm not a huge fan of personally, but it's that kind of thing. There's sort of theatrical songs that are kind of jazzy and sometimes kind of poppy and sometimes sort of avant-garde and experimental, you would say. Or some of them are sea shanties or tangos or various different things. They don't sort of quite fit into traditional musical genres. They're much more about the theatre and the kind of stuff that's being sung in them. So some favourites of mine would be, the Tiger Lilies. Listen to a lot of that. Some Tom Waits stuff. Katzenjammer. That kind of thing. Barry Addington to a certain extent. It's good, dark, noir songs that tell a story. Jill Tracy. A lot of things about people sitting at a piano singing about very, very dark subjects in quite a nice, soft, lilting kind of way. And I also listen to and so there's the dark cabaret and there's also the doom jazz, which I listen to as well. So you can kind of see where I might have got the idea for the title of the book from that. So because doom jazz, that's people like Boren and the Club de Gore, which is fantastic music for writing to. A lot of the dark cabaret stuff that I've mentioned, it can be. I can understand how it's difficult for some people to concentrate while that's being played. It can be difficult. I'm used to it now, but some people would take a little while to be able to concentrate on what they were doing while the Tiger Lilies were playing. It's a little bit much. But Boren is, I don't know if you know it at all.
Yeah, I know. I recently, well, I say recently, probably some point last year, encountered doom jazz. Yeah. Fell in love with it.
Yeah, it's great. It's sort of it's a kind of cerebral music. It's so atmospheric, and it puts you in almost a sort of a trance-like state to come up with dark, seductive, terrible thoughts. So that's really good music to write to. But I almost always write to music and try to find stuff that suits the kind of genre or story I'm trying to tell. I think when I think of Bebel, that's the Tiger Lilies and the Kronos Quartet and things like that. The Lullaby Man, in his original incarnation, was singing Tchaikovsky at every encounter. It was like da 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 da. That was his theme, the Lullaby Man theme. And the Doom Cabaret, it does frustrate me that you can't use music in writing, in prose. I mean, that's one thing that film really has, that horror films especially really have over horror writing, because I think you can do everything. You can do visuals in the written form better than the films can a lot of the time. If your descriptions are that on point, you can create something in the mind's eye that's much better than any practical effect. But we don't have music. We can't utilize that incredible arsenal that horror filmmakers have. And Midnight at the Doom Cabaret is a good case in point. I always envisioned that Mr. Bramwell, who in his original incarnation years and years and years ago, I imagined was played by Tim Curry, pre-stroke. His final encore would have been coming back on the stage while Natalie was being torn apart to perform Stephen Sondheim's Losing My Mind, you know, but I can't put that in the story. It doesn't it doesn't make sense on the page. But I think it would have worked brilliantly in a film format.
You talked about music and live performance being a theme that runs through the collection. I wonder, is there any other themes or messages that you're exploring across the book?
I think, you know, again, extreme body modification. I don't know why. It does fascinate me. But the sort of the idea of people transforming themselves into something else, I think that's a central theme of a lot of horror fiction, is transformation, willing or otherwise. And so that's always something that I come back to again and again in my writing. And it's I'm haunted by images, like I say with Bebel and the man trapped in the screaming gas mask. You know, I see these things, or these images pop into my head, or I have nightmares, and then the idea is trying to come up with a story that justifies these horrible images, the monsters or the monstrous, and not always monstrous. You know, sort of. They might be deformed, but a kind of beautiful deformity, or a repulsive glamour, you could say, you know, and sort of exploring the borderline between repulsion and attraction, and being seduced by something that should repel you. So, yeah, there's performance. There's music, body modification, transformation, and a good sort of dose of, I don't know if I'd call it confused sexuality, but certainly sexuality with a lot of angles to it, and trying to explore all these dark avenues. For which and curious obsessions. Obsession is a good word, because a lot of my characters are obsessed, whether it's with transformation or with revenge or with sex or with cannibalism. You know, these are all, there's a lot of, you would call them, I guess, sort of not just obsessives, but gourmets and aficionados of the dark arts, you could call it. But sort of people who enjoy wallowing in the darkness. I don't like writing stories, particularly. I have written a few about ordinary people, and that's par for the course in horror fiction. Some would say horror is defined almost, or has become defined by stories about ordinary people encountering the extraordinary. You know, everyone relates to horror in suburbia, that kind of stuff. But I'd rather write about people who are already extraordinary and pursuing their own deeply disturbing interests down a hole.
With regards to then the actual characters, you talk about characters within there. I wondered if any of the namings of the characters or the places had any significance.
Well, there's only one I can think of, and it's a bit unfair. I did have a music teacher when I was at school called Mr. Bramwell, and the Doom Cabaret of the title is sort of run by the compere, Mr. Bramwell, but he was nothing like the character. He was actually quite nice, and so I wouldn't want anyone to get the wrong impression. But I thought it was a little tribute, because I suppose he was a big influence on the musical side and the performative side. I mean, I was in a choir and opera troupe that he ran, a theatrical troupe. When I was at school, and he was my singing teacher and all this sort of stuff. So I it kind of seemed like a nice little tribute to put him, to give this character his name, even though he's not a very nice character at all.
But he's still a character.
Oh yeah,
that's the thing. And okay, well, one naming thing I want to talk about was actually the naming of the book. So it's John McNee's Doom Cabaret, which was something very specific that is like that is what you want to refer to as the collection. So I wondered where that came about.
It sounds like more of a sideshow, like more of an attraction. Like if you were to go to a carnival and someone was saying, come and see the freaks at Barnum and Bailey's Hootenanny, or whatever they'd call it. Come see the amazing Johnson's wacky wacky antics, all this kind of stuff. People would put their names over the top of it, so it has that carnival theme, and also it goes back to like the anthologies that I'm talking about on TV and things like Ray Bradbury's whatever it was, the Ray Bradbury Theatre, or Roald Dahl's Tales of the Unexpected, things where people planted their name on it. And when people I really wanted that name up top. Again, this collection is about sort of putting my voice forward, kind of announcing, here he is. This is what he's got to say. This is what he's about. And so it was almost more. It was like almost like you wanted that to be the first thing that people see when they're looking at the book, more important than the title or what it's about. There's this guy John McNee, and he's got these tales to tell you, right? And when you say John McNee's, as opposed to Doom Cabaret by John McNee, it just sounds like, well, he must be someone. He must be something, because that's how that titling applies in every other sphere of life. If someone puts their name above the title, whether it's John Carpenter's this, or Roald Dahl's that, or Ray Bradbury's this, or Clive Barker's Undying, it's like various different things. If it's got a name attached, you already think, well, this isn't just a collection of short stories. This is this guy's collection of short stories. Whoever he is, and that means it's special. That means there's something to this, even if they've never heard of John McNee, which they almost certainly won't have. I don't know why more people haven't done it. I mean, it's something that happens if you think about it, it happens in every other sphere of art, in films and TV and music and other things, but people don't do it with books. And I thought, well, why not? Particularly if it is a collection and you want to make absolutely clear that that's what you're doing. And it's a cabaret. I mean, most cabarets in the old days would have a name in front of them anyway, so it seems like a nice idea.
Yeah, it's like you're the ringleader, right?
Yes,
you're the
that's exactly it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the title. Now, we talked about the inside of the book. Now let's talk about the outside of the book, the cover. So one of the it's gorgeous cover. Absolutely love it. How did that come about?
Well, you might have to keep me right on this, but as far as I recall, I think it was my idea.
Yes.
Right. Okay. Because I'm not too sure these days, but I think what I originally conceived was perhaps a woman on stage, sort of representative, a vague approximation of Carmen from the book, who opens the Doom Cabaret in the story. Sort of a seductive, gothic-looking woman holding a microphone. And I thought that would be a nice idea. And then I thought, well, maybe not a full woman. Maybe she'll have her back to us like Carmen does at one point in the book, and she has Doom tattooed across her back. I thought, oh, that could be a nice idea. And then I did a couple of sketches of that myself. Not that I'm an artist, but just to try and figure out the composition of it when I was thinking about the cover, and I didn't like the way it looked. And then I thought, well, maybe something a bit simpler and more stark, because I've seen your display, the Sinister Horror Company display at conventions, and it's a great display. And if you're going to be on it, you want something that really stands out amongst all those other covers. So you don't want it to be too intricate. You want something that pops. And I thought, well, you know, a hand, a pale hand clutching a microphone, a bloodstained microphone in front of a dark curtained background, that would pop. So that's where the idea came from, and I think it worked. And I have a friend and colleague, Alan Black, who's a graphic designer, and prior to the book being, the final story being written in the book, he had been asking me if there was any opportunity, if he could have a go at doing the cover, even if he didn't get the final job. He was saying, just let me have a go at it. And I said to him, all right, okay. So he did the design, and it was good that, you know, I knew him and I worked with him, so we could actually work quite closely over the various designs, because it went through a few different formats, going back and forth over the specific shape of the hand, where the blood stains could be, you know, how much blood, how shiny or not the microphone should be, all these kind of stuff. You could actually talk about that in detail with him, and so together we, with my guidance and his artistic skills, we managed to create that image, which, like you, I really, really like. And the hand itself, again, it really is meant to be Carmen's hand clutching the microphone in the Doom Cabaret, perhaps even following the horrific events of Midnight at the Doom Cabaret, where it's still dripping with blood. And we sent that to you, and I think you came up with a final design incorporating the font, which I love, and the tagline, "Welcome to the last performance of your life," which is not half bad, I have to say.
Yeah. Oh no, I'm not going to take credit for the fonts. The fonts came from, it must have been you or Alan. You must have done those.
Really?
Yeah, because originally I'd come up with an idea for a font, but I've been playing too much Doom at the time, the computer. And so it actually ended up looking like that, and you were like, that looks like a computer game. And I had to
that was a problem. No, I remember that. I was like, oh no, maybe I shouldn't call it Doom Cabaret, because when you put it on the cover, it looks just like it's got something to do with Doom. But no, I don't think in the final version it does look like that.
So the book has been written, the cover has been made, it's about to come out. So how are you feeling just before the book is about to go out onto the wider public?
Oh man, I was so excited. We were supposed to, as I recall, have the launch at StokerCon.
Yes, StokerCon UK, that was right.
Which was going to be in, Scarborough?
Yes.
Scarborough. So I've never been to Scarborough. I'm from Glasgow. So it's a big deal for me, and a fair expense, and booking all this time and the hotels and everything else to go down to Scarborough to do it at StokerCon, which was going to be huge, I reckon. I mean, the kind of guests and the kind of people that come across to that is an international event. So yeah, fair to say I was very, very excited, and a little bit deflated when the pandemic meant that it couldn't happen, which is a bit of a shame. I mean, I bought a melodica as well, and I was teaching myself to play the melodica so that I would have, because I couldn't take a piano down with me, but I thought if I could incorporate music in some fashion, you know, in the event, wouldn't that be fun? So we could welcome people through the doors, and I would be playing all these sort of tangos or funeral dirges or something like this, and you know, really looking forward to the readings. Had my green velvet jacket already bought, and a nice cravat to wear, and all that sort of stuff. So I was really, really looking forward to it, and I've never had, like I say, because I had 3 books published before Doom Cabaret, but because it's American publishers, never got to have a launch, never got to do a reading. You know, so this was going to be pretty special for me, and it was just a bit of a shame that we weren't able to do that. We were still able to do some stuff online.
So the book is out. Obviously, there's a pandemic now. Everybody's shut away indoors, so we don't really get to kind of see people face to face to sort of talk to them. But there is the whole online presence. There's reviewers and that kind of sort of thing. So, so what was the critical reaction for the book when it sort of came out, and how did you take that?
Well, I haven't seen a bad review yet. Every review I've seen has been full of praise, which is very, very good. And we managed to get reviews in a number of prestigious places, which is always hard to do, because people have so much, are so pressed for attention. Most of the book reviewers that people are familiar with, or that have any kind of pull, like Jim McLeod, Ginger Nuts of Horror, or This Is Horror, and various places like that. They have so much on their plate. There's never any guarantee that they're going to be able to get to you. So to get reviews on those sites was fantastic, and it's been good to see the reviews. I mean, I've never had a review for any of my works that I would ever consider bad. I've had a number of one-star reviews, but they've not been bad reviews. They're always, saying things like, "This was absolutely disgusting. This is appalling. This is the most horrifying thing I've ever read." And it's like, well, yeah, cheers. That's good. So, and then again, there are people who've criticized my books, and again, it hasn't happened with Doom Cabaret, but that kind of, I mean, that's again something that you needed to get a few more readers, I think, before you get a broad spectrum of opinion. You needed to get it beyond just the horror community and get it out to people to get a spectrum of reviews, to know whether what people really think of it. And I've seen that happen with other books, and it does interest me what people say about my books. I've had things where they've praised me to the high heaven and everything that I've written, and the other ones where they've criticized a lot, and I don't necessarily agree or disagree with either. It's like I tend to find myself typically agreeing when someone praises me, that like this guy's a fantastic writer, this guy's a find. I'm like, yes, I am. Yes, indeed. And then someone says, I don't see what all the fuss is about. This is pretty by the numbers stuff, really predictable sort of shotting. And I'm like, yeah, I know, but I was hoping you wouldn't notice. So it, I take them for what they are. They're people's opinion, so I don't live or die on them, but I always get a kick out of reading them.
Yeah. And what would you say then are you most proud of about this book?
I think what I'm most proud of is the voice. What's the word? I mean, would you say coherence, or there's a sort of a nebulous kind of linking texture between them all. I think you read any of these stories and they all feel very strongly that they come from the same mind, the same person.
I'd agree. Yeah,
needling at the same kind of little issues and obsessions. I think especially considering it's my first collection and it is pulled from various different stories that I've written across the years, I'm really pleased that it sort of all feels of a piece, because when you read there are a number of short story collections that you read from especially when it's an author's first collection. What it might be is a lot of good writing, but it will all feel a bit disparate. Like they're trying this kind of voice here, they're trying that kind of voice there, they're testing things out, they're experimenting because they're still finding their feet as a writer. And one thing will be modern day, one thing will feel like it's an attempt to write a Sherlock Holmes type period piece, and another thing will be bizarro and it'll be off the wall, and it'll all be them, and it might all be very well written, but it doesn't There's nothing that allows you to say, I know who this writer is. I know what they're about. I know what makes them tick. But I hope that people, when they read John McNee's Doom Cabaret, they get a sense of what makes me tick coming through.
And on the not on the flip side, but think about it from a different way. Are there any details in the book that you think are sometimes overlooked by people when they read them?
I haven't seen much in the way of praise for the comedy. I mean, maybe it's just me. I think there's some pretty funny stuff in it. I don't know if it just sort of skips people by. I mean, amidst all the blood and deformity and things like that, but I think there's some funny stuff. I don't know what you think about that.
Can you think of any particular bits that you're referring to, or is it just sort of general tones?
Well, Dead Diana's a comedy. I mean, that's a flat-out comedy as far as I'm concerned. It's like, you know, a ludicrous sort of body horror play on The Cat Came Back. You know, this guy just can't get this woman to stay dead, and and yet people keep writing about it. You know, being in the reviews, I see people talk about it being chilling or stomach churning, and the ending, you know, keeping them awake at night. I'm like, well, okay, but did you get the gags? I mean, it's just it's like it's supposed to be. That's one that you're. I mean, I kind of enjoy. If I read something like that, I feel like it's meant to be enjoyed. But as long as people, as long as people do enjoy it, even if it's for different reasons, that's fine. Slaughterhouse Sweetheart. I think Jim McLeod called it one of the most disturbing stories he's read in a while, and I was like, it's a cartoon to me. Dr. Olafson and Mileto, you know, they're cartoon characters. These guys sitting around talking about eating baby flesh. So maybe it's my sensibilities, but I think I think there is maybe it needs people to just sort of become a bit more familiar with the book, read it a few more times. Maybe I've read the stories too many times, so I know I can tell where the jokes are, but maybe it takes other people a little bit of time to realize it.
So up for a reread of John McNee's Doom Cabaret will offer a different experience potentially then. Yeah,
I think so. Just go in looking for the puns and the sort of the little moments, the little comedy moments. But I've seen the same thing happen with like no one ever talks about the comedy in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, for example. They talk about that being the most disturbing movie ever made, but it's a very funny film. There's proper comedy in it. You know, the whole dinner scene with Grandpa they're trying to put the hammer in his hand so that he can bludgeon the girl to death, and he doesn't have the strength to hold on to it. That's proper black comedy. But I think you have to watch it maybe 10 or 20 times like I have before you realize that these things are there. So yeah, I think people might get, but it's just another reason why people should go back and read it a second or third time.
A very good piece of advice from Dr. John McNee there. Recommend a prescription of at least 2 doses of Doom Cabaret. Well, John, I just want to say thank you ever so much for taking a trip down memory lane with me and discussing your wonderful short story collection, John McNee's Doom Cabaret. John, thank you very much.
Thank you, Justin.
John McNee's Doom Cabaret by John McNee is available on paperback and Kindle. The Kindle can be purchased from Amazon. The paperback can be found through most book retailers, including Waterstones, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, and directly via the Sinister Horror Company at the website sinisterhorrorcompany.com. Thank you for listening. Being an independent publisher, we are just like you. We share the same passion, the same love for horror fiction. We believe in the incredible work being created, unnoticed by the mainstream. And we want to share it with the world. We are the Sinister Horror Company.